My parents' golden girl fired me after taking over the company, so I smiled and took everything back. I still remember the sound the office door made when it closed behind me. Not slammed, not gentle, just precise, like someone finalizing a transaction. The kind of sound you never forget once you realize it marks the end of 12 years of your life. My name is Ashley Benson. I'm 35. I was the co-founder, operations lead, and backbone of Benson & Co., a sustainable architecture and construction firm based in Portland. My parents built the foundation. I built the system. What I didn't build was their trust, at least not in the way they trusted my older sister Claire, who had never stepped foot on a construction site without designer heels and an agenda. Growing up, I understood early that competence would never compete with charm in my family. Claire was magnetic, smooth-talking, always on. I was methodical, reliable, better with plans than with speeches. From the age of 13, I spent my summers at project sites with Dad. While Claire attended leadership camps in Europe, I never resented her for being different. But I started to resent the way that difference was praised as superiority. While I studied environmental engineering and later earned dual certifications in project management and sustainable design, Claire pursued her MBA and moved through corporate positions like someone changing shoes, impressive titles with little legacy left behind. By the time I turned 23, Dad asked me to join Benson & Company full-time. "You understand this company better than anyone," he said. But it came with a warning. "Just remember, Claire's got the gift of strategy. You're the one who makes it work." I didn't argue. I got to work. Over the next decade, I transformed the company from a small family-run business into a respected name across the Pacific Northwest. I introduced cloud-based project management before it was common. I implemented our first employee stock ownership plan. I expanded our contractor network, streamlined logistics, renegotiated vendor terms, and led the completion of 15 major projects, 10 of them ahead of schedule. My parents praised the growth in interviews, but always referred to it as what the Benson sisters have accomplished together. Claire, of course, hadn't been on payroll once. We didn't fight. That was never Claire's style. She was warm, approachable, collaborative. Her skill was in taking credit before the work was done and letting praise drift in her direction like gravity. I let it happen more times than I care to admit. I told myself I didn't care as long as the company was strong. That was my first mistake. When my parents told us they were stepping back to spend more time in Hood River, I was relieved. I thought this would finally be the moment they'd let me lead officially. After all, I was already making the decisions, running the teams, closing the contracts. We sat down in the conference room that Monday morning. I had a draft leadership structure ready, along with my vision plan for the next 5 years. Claire walked in late, holding a coffee she didn't finish and wearing a crisp white blazer she'd never wear again. She sat next to Mom. I should have known then. Dad spoke first, said they'd made a decision that was best for the future of the company's image and positioning. Claire would be taking over as CEO, effective immediately. No warning, no transition, no title for me. I stared at him and said nothing. Claire smiled, thanked them, and said she was excited to modernize the vision. I excused myself from the room, walked to the bathroom, and stood in the stall for 15 minutes staring at the back of the door. No one came to check. 3 weeks later, she called me into the corner office, the one I had furnished and worked from for 5 years. She didn't ask me to sit. Her tone was cool, professional, like she was practicing for a press release. "We've reviewed the structure, and unfortunately, Your role no longer fits the new strategy. You'll receive a generous severance and a letter of recommendation. We appreciate your years of service." Then she picked up her phone and started scrolling before I said a word. I didn't cry. Not then. I picked up the 3 personal items from my desk, handed over my security badge, and walked out without saying goodbye. The people who saw me leave that day didn't know if I was heading to a client meeting or just out for lunch. Claire made sure of that. What she didn't know was that by firing me, she had opened a door I had never dared to walk through. She thought she was ending something, but I already knew where everything was buried, who held the keys, which systems had been built with invisible fail-safes. What she'd just done wasn't an ending. It was the beginning. I didn't go home right away. I drove aimlessly along the Willamette River until the skyline of downtown Portland gave way to silence and warehouses. My phone buzzed with messages from colleagues who'd heard something but weren't sure what. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I sat in my car in an empty parking lot across from a closed lumber yard and stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror for a long time. It wasn't heartbreak. It was something colder than that. A quiet severing. Claire hadn't just taken my job. She had removed me from the very structure I'd spent over a decade building. And she did it with the kind of smile that tells you she enjoyed it. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise like I always did. My body still moved out of habit, even though I had nowhere to be. I opened my laptop and stared at the desktop wallpaper, a drone photo of the Jameson Green project we'd finished early last year. That had been my proudest work. It stood now as a monument to someone who, according to Claire, was no longer relevant. I opened a blank document and started writing down everything I could remember: project names, client details, supplier contacts, internal policies. I wasn't sure why yet, but my instincts told me to gather. By the second day, I had turned my kitchen into a war room. Blueprints were stacked next to legal files. My whiteboard leaned against the fridge. I ordered a corkboard from an office supply site and began pinning timelines and names to it like a detective, trying to understand how everything fell apart. But it hadn't fallen apart. It had been dismantled piece by piece, and I had helped build every piece. That meant I could take it apart too, if I needed to. I reached out to only one person that week, June Morales, our senior accountant, someone who had always balanced professionalism with quiet loyalty. We met for coffee at a bookstore on Hawthorne. She looked around before sitting and lowered her voice when she spoke. Claire had already begun making leadership adjustments. 2 project managers had been reassigned. Several subcontractors reported delayed payments. Claire had brought in an outside consultant to modernize operations, someone from her MBA circle with 0 experience in construction. The mood in the office, June said, was confused at best and unstable at worst. I asked June a direct question. Is she trying to run the company or sell it? June hesitated, then said she didn't know. But Claire had scheduled a private meeting with Brighton Development Group, a commercial firm that had approached us twice in the past to discuss partnerships, and both times had been turned down. Claire was calling it an industry insight session. I knew better. That night, I reviewed the company's bylaws. 3 years ago, during a major internal restructuring, I had been the one to work with our legal advisor, David Lee, on revisions. I called David the next day under the pretense of a personal favor. Over lunch, I asked whether I was still legally listed as a board member. He confirmed I was. Being fired from my employee role didn't automatically remove me from the board, and as a 15% equity holder, I still had voting power. That meant Claire couldn't make certain executive decisions, including the sale of assets, without full board approval. And that board included me. David's face didn't change, but his words landed with clarity. Ashley, if she's trying to dismantle the company or transfer ownership without full board consensus, she's skating on legal ice. That sentence replayed in my mind like a mantra. Over the next 5 days, I created a full map of what mattered most to the company's survival. Not just money, people, clients, trust. I called Michael Tran, our former head of site operations, now semi-retired in Salem. He had always trusted me more than anyone else. When I told him I'd been fired, he didn't say he was surprised. He just asked what I needed. I said, eyes and ears, quiet ones. He agreed without conditions. The hardest part was not reacting, not sending a furious email, not confronting Claire in public, not demanding explanations from my parents, who hadn't even called. I knew how Claire operated. If I challenged her too early, she would spin it into drama and use it to discredit me. I had to stay quiet long enough for her to unravel herself, because she didn't understand the company the way I did. She saw it as a brand, not as a living system of people, obligations, and timelines. Eventually, that disconnect would show, and when it did, I'd be ready. I wasn't preparing to destroy the company. I was preparing to protect it. From her. From anyone who thought they could strip it for parts and leave the rest behind. That was never what Benson & Copeland was built for. I wasn't angry in the way people think of anger. It wasn't loud. It wasn't explosive. It was methodical, cold, steady, like concrete setting in place. By the end of the week, I had gathered everything I needed to start phase 1, the emails, the legal standing, the client relationships, the quiet allies. I still hadn't told my parents a word. Not yet. Because the next move wouldn't be a conversation. It would be something much harder to ignore. On Monday morning, Claire announced in a press release that Benson & Cote had entered exploratory talks with strategic partners to expand its long-term vision. The wording was vague, but the signal was clear. She was planning something big. And she wanted the world to think it was growth. I knew the truth. Claire had never built anything that didn't already exist. She leveraged reputation, not relationships. She talked about scaling and synergy like they were guarantees, not risks. But the company wasn't a pitch deck. It was a living, breathing machine that couldn't be managed from behind tinted glass and filtered jargon. I scheduled a quiet breakfast with Roger Mitchell, our longtime client from Forest View Properties, whose 3 ongoing developments accounted for nearly a quarter of our active revenue. We met at the same cafe where I had first presented him a value-engineered design 5 years earlier. He didn't ask what happened at the company. He just said, "We're not sure who's running things anymore, and it's starting to show." I told him I was no longer involved operationally, but that I was still on the board. I didn't ask him to do anything. I just thanked him for the years of trust and told him I was available for consultation if needed. That was all it took. Within 2 days, his legal team sent a notice of concern to Benson & Cody, citing changes in project oversight and requesting a pause on contractor payment disbursement. Claire tried to spin it as a routine compliance check, but internally it triggered a freeze on nearly $500,000 in expected cash flow. A week later, 2 more clients followed suit. One of them mentioned that Claire had missed a scheduled review meeting entirely, sending an intern in her place without context. That was when the cracks started showing from the outside. Inside the company, Things were unraveling faster than I expected. Michael called from a private number and said Claire had let go of our senior site supervisor in an unannounced Friday meeting, supposedly to reduce operational redundancy. What that actually meant was she didn't understand what he did, so she assumed he wasn't necessary. June sent me a spreadsheet showing invoice processing delays stacked up by 2 weeks and growing. I didn't tell her what I was planning. I just said, keep saving copies, everything. The final piece came from David, our lawyer, who had quietly requested access to internal memos through his role as board counsel. He forwarded me an unsigned draft agreement between Benson and Copley and Brighton Group, detailing the sale of 2 company-owned properties and shared equipment assets at valuations below market rate. It was dated 3 days before Claire officially became CEO. Her name was already on the signature line. I printed the agreement and laid it beside my father's old leather portfolio, the one I hadn't opened since the day I was let go. Inside were notes, vendor contracts, design drafts, and a hand-drawn sketch I'd made the week we launched our first passive energy housing prototype. I looked at that sketch and didn't feel bitterness. I felt stillness, the kind that comes before something shifts. Claire wasn't just gambling with assets. She was gutting the heart of something I had poured my identity into. She believed the company was hers now, and that nothing I did would change that. She was wrong. I called a board meeting. It was quiet, formal, and legally indisputable. As an equity holder and board member, I had the right to raise concerns related to major financial decisions and operational stability. I didn't notify Claire directly. I sent the email to the board's legal inbox with documentation attached and a summary of observed risk. Then I waited. I didn't have to wait long. That evening, my mother called. Her voice was tight, controlled, like she was trying not to sound alarmed. She asked if we could meet for dinner. I said yes, and chose a restaurant far enough from downtown that it wouldn't feel like a trap. She arrived alone. No Dad, no Claire. She looked tired in a way I hadn't seen before. She asked me why I was doing this. I said, because you left me no choice. She said they thought Claire would bring fresh energy to the brand. I told her she brought hollow ambition and spreadsheets filled with borrowed language. She didn't answer right away. Then she asked what I wanted. I didn't tell her yet. I wasn't here to negotiate. I was here to deliver a signal. Mom, I said, you don't have to believe me, but the people who actually keep the company moving are crews, our clients, our suppliers, they do, and they're watching. She nodded slowly, and for the first time since I was a child, she didn't interrupt me. The board meeting was scheduled for Thursday at 9 a.m., but I arrived by 8:30. I wanted to be in the room before Claire walked in, not after. The conference table still looked the same, long and polished, with the framed project photos hanging behind it. I had picked out those photos myself years ago, highlighting our proudest builds, not the most profitable, but the ones that reflected who we were. That detail felt important now. My father came in first. He greeted me with that restrained professionalism he always used in high-stakes meetings, as if pretending everything was normal would keep it from falling apart. My mother followed, quiet and unreadable, nodding once before taking her seat. Then Claire entered, 10 minutes late, holding her phone and an air of confidence that didn't quite reach her eyes. She wore navy again, like she had something to prove. She sat at the head of the table and opened her laptop with practiced ease. No apology, no greeting, just, let's get started. I let her lead for the first few minutes. She presented slides filled with charts and bullet points, all using words like disruption, agility, vertical growth. She painted a picture of progress, but no one at the table looked convinced. Then she turned to me and said, "Ashley, I assume you called this meeting to address concerns, so let's hear it." I opened a file folder and slid 3 documents across the table, one to each board member. The first was the draft sale agreement to Brighton Group. The second was a summary of client complaints and project holds. The third was a legal memo from David outlining how the attempted sale violated board policy and could trigger breach of governance penalties. Claire laughed, a short, sharp sound that didn't match the tension in the room. "This is a gross overreaction," she said. "These were exploratory talks, nothing more." I didn't respond to her. I spoke directly to my parents. This isn't about differences in style or vision. It's about transparency and responsibility. The decisions Claire is making don't just reflect bad judgment. They put the company and every person depending on it at risk. My father looked down at the documents, jaw tight, not speaking. My mother finally broke the silence. "Claire, is it true these conversations with Brighton happened before your appointment as CEO?" Claire hesitated for a split second, then recovered. "I was preparing for a smooth leadership transition, exploring external insights. That's what executives do." But it was too late. That moment of hesitation had cracked through the illusion she'd built. I continued. "You dismissed senior staff without replacement. You missed client meetings. You stalled payments to key contractors. And now, the very clients who kept us afloat for years are freezing contracts because they don't trust what you're doing." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The numbers did the talking. June had compiled a clear financial timeline showing the cost of Claire's short tenure, project delays, rising overhead, deferred revenue. The brand wasn't evolving, it was unraveling. Claire turned defensive, accusing me of sabotage, of orchestrating a coup out of jealousy. I let her finish, then looked straight at my father. "You asked me to build this company's operational core. I did that. And when you handed the top seat to someone who hadn't built a single thing inside these walls, I didn't walk away. I gave her the benefit of the doubt, but I will not watch everything we created get sold for parts just so she can save face with people who will disappear the moment the money runs dry." My father closed the folder slowly, folded his hands, and asked Claire if she had anything to add. She shook her head, eyes narrowing, but said nothing. He turned to David and asked what our legal obligations were. David's answer was clear. The attempted sale required full board approval, which had not been granted. The financial risk was substantial, and Claire's continued leadership was now a liability. The room stayed silent as my mother spoke. Her voice was quieter than I expected. "I think we made a mistake," she said, looking not at me, but at the documents. "We underestimated what it takes to hold this company together." My father called for a vote. Claire objected, but protocol allowed it. The result was 3-1. No confidence, effective immediately. Claire would be removed from the CEO role. Pending a full review, she stood abruptly, chair scraping behind her, and pointed at me. "You've wanted this all along. Don't pretend you're the hero here. I didn't flinch. I didn't want this. But I won't stand by and let you ruin it either." She stormed out, and for the first time in a long while, the room didn't feel like it was leaning in her direction. After the door closed, my father looked at me and said, "We need to talk about what happens next." And I said, "We will, but I'm not coming back to clean up someone else's mess without real authority." He nodded. My mother didn't speak, but she didn't look away this time either. That night, I didn't celebrate. I didn't pour wine or replay the meeting in my head for satisfaction. I sat at my dining table, surrounded by folders and notes that had become part of my daily rhythm, and stared at the open space where so many of my plans had started. What happened at the boardroom wasn't a victory. It was a reset. The mess wasn't gone. It had just been acknowledged. Now someone had to clean it up, and every eye in the room had turned toward me like it was obvious who that someone should be. I didn't mind the wait. I just didn't want to carry it under old terms. By morning, 3 emails were waiting. One from my father asking when we could talk. One from the head of Riverbend Developments requesting urgent clarification on project continuity. And one from June with an updated cash flow forecast that didn't look good. Claire had done more damage than anyone realized. Vendor trust had eroded. Clients were withholding payments. Internal morale had splintered. The brand might have survived publicly, but inside, it was held together by threads. And threads break easily under pressure. I called Michael and asked him to meet me at the riverfront job site within 2 hours. I needed his eyes on something structural. He didn't hesitate. When I arrived, he was already there, walking the perimeter with one of the junior engineers who looked relieved to see a familiar face with authority. The tension was clear. Soil data from the East Wing had come back irregular, and the temporary supports that Claire's team had signed off on weren't enough. I reviewed the test reports, walked the grade, and made the call. Immediate reinforcement. No waiting. No more shortcuts. We began mobilizing a crew before the city inspectors were even notified. If the issue had been ignored another 48 hours, it could have delayed the entire development by weeks and cost the firm more than $1 million in penalties. The client arrived mid-crisis and saw me on site in a hard hat coordinating with contractors. He didn't ask what had happened at the top. He just said, "It's good to see you back." That moment told me what I needed to know. I wasn't asking to be handed anything. I was already doing the job. But this time, I would do it by my own terms, not as a loyal daughter or invisible backbone. I called my parents the next morning and told them we'd need to meet at their house for a proper discussion. I didn't want another meeting room. I wanted them to sit across from me at the same dining table where they had once made decisions without me. We met that evening. My mother had cooked pot roast again, the same meal she served the night they handed the company to Claire. This time, the silence before dinner was heavier. No announcements, no wine, just acknowledgement that the balance of power had shifted. And everyone at the table knew it. My father started first. "Ashley, we made mistakes. We know that. We ignored what was happening, and we ignored you." I let the words sit between us for a moment. Then I said what needed to be said. "I'm willing to lead Benson and Coterie. I believe in what we built, but I won't do it under the old structure. I won't be a placeholder. I want a full transfer of voting rights and 51% ownership. I'm not doing this for symbolism. I need control to execute the recovery the way it has to be done." My mother looked at me, eyes watering slightly, but didn't interrupt. My father asked what would happen if they said no. I didn't flinch. "Then I'll continue as an external consultant, stabilize what I can, and when it's over, I'll launch my own firm. Some clients and key staff will come with me. You'll still have a company, but it won't grow again." The silence afterward was different. It wasn't defensive. It was resigned, maybe even relieved. My mother finally spoke. "What about Claire?" I looked at both of them evenly. "That's a family issue. It's not a business one anymore." They didn't argue. 2 days later, the paperwork was signed. My parents retained a collective 44%. With the remaining 5% set aside symbolically for Tyler, who had been a quiet supporter throughout. Claire was removed from the board, and her ownership stake bought out in a private agreement with a non-disclosure clause. I didn't push for more. I just wanted her out. That night, I stood alone in the office. The lights were low, and the city beyond the glass walls looked softer somehow. This wasn't revenge. It was reclamation. I hadn't taken anything that wasn't already mine. The first Monday under the new structure didn't feel like a new beginning. It felt like cleanup. The phones didn't stop ringing. Clients wanted reassurance. Staff needed answers. And invoices that had been sitting untouched now demanded immediate handling. I didn't walk in and make grand speeches. I didn't hold a town hall or call for a rebranding campaign. I sat down at the same desk I had been pushed out of 6 weeks earlier and started fixing what had been ignored. The office was quieter than I remembered. Some people kept their heads low, unsure whether I would come in bitter or triumphant. I came in clear. The first thing I did was meet with June. We sat in the small conference room and walked through every open balance, delayed payment, and supplier conflict. I asked her what she needed most. She said stability. She didn't say loyalty. She didn't need to. After that, I spoke with Michael and brought him in as director of field operations. He had been semi-retired, but he still knew more about site conditions than most engineers twice his age. When I asked if he was ready to return, he didn't hesitate. If you're running it, I'm in. By midweek. I called Carlos Rodriguez, a former project lead who had left during Claire's transition. I asked if he'd be open to coming back to lead sustainability initiatives. He said yes before I finished the sentence. We didn't make a big announcement, but the word spread fast. People noticed the old crew walking the halls again. Meetings started running on time. Contractors began responding with urgency. The shift wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, steady, trust, once broken. Doesn't come back with applause. It returns in increments. Meanwhile, I met with our 3 largest clients face to face. I didn't bring legal reps. I didn't pitch them anything. I just explained what had happened and laid out a recovery plan. I told them the company would no longer be run from spreadsheets, disconnected from the ground. I told them we'd be on site, we'd listen, and we'd correct every mistake made under Claire's watch. To my surprise, they didn't just nod, they leaned in. One of them, a developer I had clashed with years ago over design specs, looked me in the eye and said, "This company finally feels like it has a heartbeat again." That line stayed with me. In the weeks that followed, we restarted the paused projects, restructured our credit line with the bank, and renegotiated vendor terms that had gone cold. But the most important thing we did wasn't financial, it was cultural. I called a full staff meeting, not to give a speech, but to listen. I asked one question: what needs to change for you to believe this place is worth staying? The answers came slowly at first, then honestly. They wanted clearer communication, fair promotion paths, real mentorship. They wanted to stop seeing talent overlooked because it didn't come with a degree or a loud voice. I told them we'd build exactly that, and we did. I formed a mentorship program focused on frontline workers who showed initiative but never got tapped for leadership. I created a quarterly innovation fund to test sustainable construction ideas submitted by any employee. We didn't promise perfection. We promised follow-through. Slowly, the mood changed. People started staying late again, not out of fear, but because they cared. Outside the company, the industry took notice. A regional design magazine featured our riverfront recovery story. A local university invited me to speak at a panel on ethical growth in family businesses. I almost declined. Then I remembered what it felt like to sit in silence while someone else told a version of the story that didn't include me. So I said yes. At the panel, Someone asked what advice I had for women building careers inside family-run firms. I thought for a moment, then said, build receipts, not resentment, document everything, deliver results, and know the difference between being respected and being tolerated. One is earned, the other is endured. They wrote that down. I didn't say it for applause. I said it because I had lived it. As summer turned to fall, Benson & Company didn't just recover, it evolved. We closed out our fiscal quarter at 14% higher revenue than the same time the previous year. Employee retention stabilized. Vendor partnerships re-engaged. But more than that, we had clarity. No more guessing where decisions came from. No more working in someone else's shadow. I didn't post about any of it. I didn't share updates online. I let the results speak. The week after the quarterly review, I took a Saturday morning off for the first time in months, not to relax, but to reset. I drove out to a coffee shop tucked in the hills west of Portland, where no one from the office would recognize me. I brought a notebook and nothing else. No laptop, no files, just paper and a pen, for hours. I wrote everything I had learned since the day I was fired. Not about construction or leadership, but about trust, power, and the cost of silence. I wrote about the danger of thinking that doing good work is enough to protect you from people who are better at performing confidence than building results. I wrote about watching people you love choose convenience over fairness. But I also wrote about how people can change and how sometimes survival isn't just about holding on. It's about knowing when to stop protecting people who wouldn't do the same for you. Later that week, I met Tyler for dinner. He had flown in from Chicago to visit for the first time since the company shifted hands. We hadn't spoken much about it since the early days. But over grilled fish and wine, he looked at me and said, I saw it happening for years. I just didn't know how to help. I told him that most people didn't. That was the thing about subtle erasure. It didn't always look like abuse. It looked like being passed over for credit one too many times. It looked like being asked to fix things in the background while someone else took the call in front of the client. It looked like smiling in photos you knew you deserved to lead, but were always placed 2 rows behind. Tyler didn't interrupt. He just nodded and said, You always stayed calm, even when it was unfair. I smiled at that, not because it was praise, but because it was true. Calm wasn't a mask. It was the strategy. By then, the ripple effects of Claire's removal had fully played out. The legal settlement was finalized. She signed a non-disclosure agreement in exchange for a structured buyout. The conditions were strict. No future involvement in company affairs. No statements to the press. She relocated to Los Angeles shortly after. We hadn't spoken since the vote, and honestly, I didn't expect to. There was nothing left to explain. Closure wasn't always a conversation. Sometimes it was just the absence of new damage. Around that time, I began working with a leadership coach, not because I needed help fixing problems, but because I wanted to prevent old habits from creeping back in. One afternoon, during a session, she asked me something that stuck with me. Ashley, if no one ever gives you the credit you deserve, would you still do the work the same way? I answered quickly, without thinking, yes, because the building still stands either way. She didn't smile or nod. She just let that answer sit in the room until I realized what it meant. It wasn't about recognition anymore. It was about authorship. My name didn't need to be on the door, but the fingerprints I left on this company were undeniable. By the time fall settled in, Benson & Company had not only stabilized, it had grown in unexpected ways. We launched a partnership with a local technical college to recruit apprentices directly from underserved communities. Our supplier review board diversified vendors and gave priority to companies that mirrored our values in sustainability and ethics. And for the first time in company history, we implemented a performance feedback system where team members could anonymously evaluate leadership. No one was off limits, not even me. The results were humbling. Some praised the new direction. Others said I could communicate more. One comment stood out. It said, "She listens, but sometimes you can tell she's still fighting ghosts no one else can see." I sat with that sentence for days. They weren't wrong. Leading something you were once discarded from came with its own shadows. But the work of healing wasn't just internal, it was cultural. So I started opening every monthly team meeting with one truth I had learned the hard way. Not as a lesson, just as a reminder that people can outgrow their own silence. That winter, we were nominated for an award in sustainable innovation by the Regional Builders Coalition. I didn't attend the gala. June accepted it on our behalf. When she called later to tell me we had won, I thanked her, but didn't ask what the plaque said. That part didn't matter anymore. By the start of the new year, the company was no longer in survival mode. It was moving, quietly and steadily, towards something closer to what I had always hoped it could be. There were no banners or press releases, no back-patting celebrations, just progress, marked by deadlines met, relationships repaired, and a culture that no longer needed to be policed from the top down. One afternoon, I stood on the upper deck of the Thompson Green development as our team wrapped final inspections. The wind was sharp, but the view was clean. You could see the river curve along the edge of the city, and behind it, the silhouettes of buildings we had helped shape. I wasn't thinking about legacy. I was thinking about clarity. A lot of people asked me, quietly, what it felt like to have won. I never liked that word. This wasn't a competition. Claire didn't lose. She just revealed herself. And when someone shows you what they're really prioritizing, when they treat loyalty like currency and people like assets, you don't fight them head on. You get out of their way and let their decisions carry the consequences. And that's exactly what happened. The company didn't collapse, but the parts built on performance and proximity cracked first. What remained was the part people had built together, not for applause, but because they believed in the work. That was the part I returned to. In March, I spoke at a panel for women in male-dominated industries. I wasn't there for exposure. A friend of mine from college had asked me to do it as a favor. I didn't prepare a formal speech. I just told the story as plainly as I could. No bitterness, no dramatics. I talked about watching someone else walk into the room with none of the history and all of the power, and how hard it was to keep working anyway. I said that in family businesses. The hardest decisions are the ones where you have to choose between being quiet to keep the peace or speaking up and risking your seat at the table. Someone asked me what I would tell my younger self, and I said, don't confuse being needed with being respected. A few women in the room wrote that down. At home, things with my parents were quieter, but different. We met once a week, usually on Sundays, and never talked about Claire unless they brought it up. They didn't defend her anymore, but they didn't condemn her either. There was a kind of shared regret that hung in the air, not just for what had happened, but for what they hadn't seen sooner. During one dinner, my father said, without looking up, "We thought you didn't need our protection because you were strong." That was lazy. My mother didn't speak, but her hand reached across the table, rested on mine for a few seconds, and then returned to her lap. That moment didn't erase anything, but it made room for something else. Maybe not forgiveness, but awareness. That was enough. Claire stayed in Los Angeles. From what I heard through old contacts, she tried to start a consulting firm, then pivoted to tech branding, then paused everything for a personal wellness reset. I never checked her website. I didn't need to. The truth was, I didn't feel anger anymore, just space, a lot of it, like the kind of distance you build intentionally, not out of punishment, but preservation. Some people belong to your past, even if they were once central to your story, especially then. In April, we launched a small internal journal at the company, featuring articles, photos, and stories from different teams across the organization. One submission came from a project foreman who had been with us since the beginning. He wrote about the early days of working under chaos, how things used to get done through sheer willpower, and how, lately, the silence had changed. Now when things are quiet, he wrote, it doesn't mean someone's hiding. It means someone already handled it. That line hit me harder than most awards ever could. I printed it and kept it on my desk, not for motivation, but for grounding, because the truth is, redemption doesn't always arrive as a single moment. Sometimes it's the quiet rhythm of being trusted again by the people who actually know what it cost you to stay. By early summer, the office felt different, not louder, not busier, just steadier. People weren't holding their breath anymore. They were working, collaborating, taking initiative without second-guessing whether someone at the top would suddenly shift direction without warning. We weren't a flashy company. We didn't make headlines. But I started to notice how often our name came up in quiet conversations, vendors recommending us without prompt, city planners calling for advice on permitting strategy, young engineers requesting to intern not because of reputation, but because they'd heard someone inside cared about the details. That kind of growth didn't show up on dashboards, but it meant more than numbers ever did. Tyler came to town again in June and asked to walk one of our new sites. He hadn't done that in years. We visited a low-impact housing project we'd just broken ground on. It was built on a narrow hillside plot with elevation challenges most firms avoided. I showed him the plans and how we'd engineered slope stabilization without tearing down native trees. He looked at the drawings and said, "This is the kind of work people won't notice unless it fails." I smiled and told him that was exactly the point. Real integrity is invisible when done right. That night, over dinner, he asked if I ever thought about stepping back if maybe. After everything, I deserved a break. I told him I didn't need distance from the work. I just needed distance from the part of me that thought I had to prove something. That version of me had already served her purpose. She built the bridge I was standing on now. In July, we received a request from a former competitor asking to collaborate on a municipal infrastructure bid. It was the same company that had once tried to poach our senior staff during Claire's brief tenure. They weren't coming back out of goodwill. They came because we had quietly become the one firm in the region that delivered on time, treated partners respectfully, and didn't pad reports with buzzwords. I didn't reject the offer, but I didn't say yes right away either. I asked for 3 weeks, not to stall, but to give myself time to think about whether we wanted alignment or just validation. Eventually, we said yes, but on our terms, with full transparency and clear language about ethical compliance. They agreed. I never once mentioned the past. That same month, our internal mentorship program reached its 6-month mark. One of our junior project assistants, a woman named Imani, who had joined straight out of a local community college, presented a redesigned proposal that saved nearly $50,000 in materials cost without compromising code. She had been overlooked by a previous manager who thought she was too soft-spoken for field work. I sat in on her presentation, watched her walk through the proposal without stumbling once, and felt something shift. Not pride, something deeper. Confirmation that this place wasn't being rebuilt in my image. It was becoming something better because I had stepped back just enough to let others take real ownership. There were still difficult days. Budget overruns happened. Permits got delayed. Staff occasionally left for bigger firms, offering flashier benefits. But what changed was how we responded. No blame games, no denial, just adjustment, quiet fixes rooted in clear values. I started spending 1 day a week away from the main office, usually in the field or meeting with community leaders, listening more than I spoke. At one site visit, an older contractor pulled me aside and said, "I've worked with a lot of companies, but this one doesn't feel like it's run by ego. That's rare." I thanked him, but didn't linger. Some compliments are best left unframed. By August, we had submitted 2 grant proposals for sustainable retrofitting in public school buildings. Both were accepted. The design lead on that team was Diana, who had once risked her job by quietly warning me about Claire's Brighton deal. Now she was directing long-term planning and mentoring 2 new hires of her own. Her office had sketches taped to the walls, Post-it notes everywhere, and a whiteboard filled with calculations. When I passed by one afternoon, she looked up and asked, "Do you think we'll ever feel like this is done?" I said, "I hope not. Some stories aren't meant to be finished. They're meant to evolve." In quieter moments, I sometimes found myself thinking about that first morning after Claire fired me, the stillness of my apartment, the fog outside my kitchen window, the sound of my own breath while I stared at an empty calendar. It had felt like erasure, but now I understood it wasn't an ending. It was the moment the story stopped being about proximity to power and started being about actual value. And once you know your value, no one can take it from you again. On the anniversary of my departure from the company, the one Claire had taken over and nearly hollowed out, I stood in the same meeting room where it had happened, not out of nostalgia, and not to prove a point. It was simply the only space available that morning for a last-minute strategic briefing. The glass walls still reflected that same muted light. The tables still polished but a little worn now at the edges. But this time, I wasn't seated across from someone delivering decisions behind a mask of corporate niceties. This time, I was surrounded by people I trusted: our finance lead, 2 new design directors, and the head of community partnerships. They were talking numbers, timelines, and staffing transitions. There was no tension in the air, no performance, just clarity and forward motion. After the meeting, I stayed in the room a little longer, not to linger on the past, but to acknowledge how far things had come. I remembered sitting there 12 months ago, trying to keep my hands from shaking while Claire, with all the calm detachment of someone delivering a weather report, informed me that the board felt it was time to evolve the company's direction. She had spoken like she was reading someone else's script. I had walked out that day without saying much. I remember the exact color of the sky outside: gray, flat, without contrast. It felt like the world had gone quiet in the wrong way. Now, everything was quiet in the right way. Progress didn't need applause. Truth didn't need volume. The company I had returned to wasn't built to center me. It was built to withstand storm patterns without fracturing again. That mattered more than any title I had ever held. Later that week, Claire's name appeared in an industry newsletter, a brief paragraph tucked between executive moves and funding rounds. She had joined a lifestyle tech brand as a creative consultant. The article didn't mention our past. It didn't need to. I read the line once, then closed the tab. There was no spike in my heart rate, no bitterness, just neutrality. I didn't wish her failure. I just wished her distance. I spent that weekend with my sister Ava, who had flown in from Portland. We sat at a neighborhood cafe she liked, and she asked if I had finally let it go. I told her it wasn't something you let go of. It was something you outgrew, like a tight dress that once felt like armor, but now feels unnecessary. She nodded and said, "That's the kind of healing no one claps for, but it's the most honest kind." I agreed. One of the last projects I signed off on before that summer closed was a mentorship pipeline we launched with 3 local trade schools. The program wasn't flashy. It didn't come with awards or TV interviews, but it was designed to make space for people like the version of me who had once believed that being irreplaceable was the same as being safe. The first round of mentees toured our main office in September. One of them, barely 19, asked what I did at the company. I smiled and said, "I listen." She laughed like I was joking. I wasn't. By fall, I had started spending more time outside of strategy and more inside the culture of the company. I didn't need to steer the ship anymore. We had good captains, each steady in their own lane. My role had become less visible and more vital. Sometimes that's where power hides, in the space between the lines, not above them. We closed the year with a small, private celebration. No media, no headlines, just staff, some family, and a few longtime partners. I stood near the back of the room, letting the others speak, toast, share moments. Diana gave a short, powerful speech about the difference between building fast and building well. I saw people nod, not because they were being polite, but because they recognized themselves in her words. Near the end, someone asked me if I had any final thoughts. I walked up, took the mic, and paused. Then I said, "A year ago, someone told me I was no longer essential. They didn't say it with cruelty, just confidence, like the decision had already been accepted by everyone else. What they didn't realize was that being underestimated isn't a sentence. It's a season. And if you survive it with integrity, you come back stronger, not to prove them wrong, but to remember who you are without their approval." That room didn't erupt in applause. It didn't need to. The silence was full. I left shortly after. No grand exit, no final bow, just gratitude. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't a public spectacle. It's walking back into the room they once told you didn't belong in, and feeling absolutely no need to explain why you're still standing. And maybe that's the real question we should be asking, not who took what from us, or when we'll get it back. But this, who are we when no one is watching? And would we still choose that version of ourselves if the world forgot everything else?